We will announce this again at the end in case. I think we better start even though we don't have a full hall because the introductions will take a little time. This is an important plenary session. It's on the subject of nuclear and WMD-free zones in the Middle East, which, as you know, is a very important agenda item in NPT review conferences ever since 1995. I think the only rationale for me to be on the panel and to chair it is because I have some kind of historical association with the genesis of this subject in the UN in general and in the NPT review conference in particular. We have very fortunately got two panelists from the region itself, Nasser Hadian from Iran, professor of political science at the University of Tehran, and Khaled, Shamaa, former permanent representative of Egypt to the international organizations in Vienna. And to comment, we have Togzhan Kassenova from Kazakhstan, who is based in Washington with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now, a little bit of background. Of course, Nasser Hadian is a professor of political science at the University of Tehran, and Khaled Shamaa is a former PR. And interestingly, it was Iran and Egypt who first had the co-sponsorship of the resolution in the UN General Assembly asking for a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. It was subsequently converted into a WMD-free zone by the intervention of President Mubarak of Egypt, and ever since then, a WMD-free zone has been the demand of most of the region, except, of course, for Israel. If I might, first of all, take the floor to give you some background. We had the incontestable fact that the Middle East region, which is where we are trying to see a weapons of mass destruction-free zone as distinct from a nuclear weapon-free zone, established because it is one of the most weaponized regions, and it has the highest level of militarization in the world, according to the BICC's Global Militarization Index. Now, in addition to that, the NPT is subscribed to by all members except Israel, and so that takes care of one weapon of mass destruction. As far as the Biological Weapons Convention is concerned, again, Israel is not a member of the BWC, and Egypt and Syria are signatories but have not ratified. Is that right? Chemical Weapons Convention, Egypt and Syria have not joined it, and Israel is a signatory but has not yet ratified. So we go on to the brief history. In the 17th session of the UNGA in 1963, Egypt first suggested that there should be 9 conditions for establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. In the 29th session in 1974, Egypt and Iran introduced a resolution calling for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. The resolution was adopted at the UNGA by a majority of 138 members, and it was only Israel and Burma, Myanmar, curiously, which abstained. In 1980 onwards, there was no opposition to the annual resolution. Even Israel agreed to this idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. In 1990, the UN was called upon to make a study on the effective and verifiable measures which would pave the way for a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, and confidence-building measures were suggested as one way. This UN study, and I remember who were the members of the UN study. There was Nabil Fahmy was there, Ben Sanders of Netherlands, and I think there was Jan Pravits from Sweden, who made a very good study. And I think they examined the geographical extent of the weapons of mass destruction free zone outlined the borders of it, and talked about basic prohibitions like a ban on any form of possession of a nuclear weapon by some states, and the decision will be needed on whether this ban will or will not extend to particular installations or equipment aimed at either the development or the delivery of a weapon. And as far as verification is concerned, they also had procedures defined to reinforce the existing IAEA safeguards which may be needed, and with staff to implement this. Let me go back a little bit. I think we have to fast forward now to 1995, or just before that, when President Mubarak converted the nuclear weapon-free zone proposal into the establishment of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And then comes the Middle East arms control decisions. And 1995 is when I presided over the NPT Review and Extension Conference, where a major sticking point was the support of the Arab countries for the extension, indefinite extension of the treaty. And their problem was that there was the problem of Israel as the only weapon, nuclear weapon, although not officially declared, state in the region, and they wanted to have universality. So they stipulated that one of the conditions for their agreement to the indefinite extension of the NPT was that there should be a resolution on the Middle East. So what I had to do in order to ensure the adoption of a package was we had two documents that were negotiated in the presidential consultations based on a draft from South Africa. The strengthening of the review process was one, and the others were a statement of principles and standards with regard to the NPT in general. And the third element of the package was this resolution on the Middle East, stipulating that there should be a conference in order to negotiate a Middle East region free of weapons of mass destruction. And I can assure you that it was not easy, but it was only the adoption of that element of the package that enabled us to have an adoption of the entire package and the seamless extension of the treaty indefinitely without a vote. And so it was a crucial element in the package. Now, unfortunately, as soon as the conference was over, this was conveniently forgotten by many of the participants, especially the nuclear weapon states, and it led to a lot of discontent. In the conference after that in 2000, no move was made to implement the resolution, and by 2005, the discontent of the Arab countries had grown to such an extent that this issue broke the conference in 2005 and made it not possible to achieve a consensus decision. So in 2010, when the review conference was held, there was very aggressive leadership from the Egyptians of the Arab group, and I think they were able to insist on some kind of compromise with regard to this resolution. And that compromise was made when it was decided that a special negotiator would be appointed and that a conference would be held in 2012. That special negotiator was chosen by the Secretary General in consultation with the depositories, and it was Ambassador Lava of Finland, who then proceeded to negotiate for this conference, which unfortunately never took place, although he had several consultations. So in 2015, it was quite predictable that the NPT review conference would not succeed because no progress had been made on this issue. And I would imagine that in 2020, this would be another recurring problem. for the participants in the 2020 review conference. Now, with that updating of the developments, I think it's appropriate for me to now begin the contribution from the panelists. We have, as I said, the original sponsors of the resolution in the UNGA represented here. And if I may give the first floor to our friend from Iran, Mr. Nasser Hadian, who will give us his point of view. May I ask the participants to take 15 minutes for their presentation, and we'll come back to you at a later stage. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I'll try to be as quick as possible and as controversial as I can to wake you up. First of all, as you mentioned, Iran and Egypt in 1974 introduced that resolution, and Iran has been seeking basically a WMD-free in the region for the last several decades. But the point, although it is very important to have in that mind, but the question is why we don't have it yet. And since personally I was involved with a few other friends for several years in discussing and debating these issues in Germany particularly, so what I have been able to drive from our discussions in Germany is basically are the points which I would discuss in a few minutes. So I would like to address what are the reasons, what are the causes of not having any sort of agreements for zone of Middle East. If we put aside the whole idea of the zones and the regions, how do we define them, who are the members of it, who can be excluded, who are included, let's put that aside, which we had a lot of discussion about it. But to me, if I want to be very blunt, these are the reasons which I mentioned. First of all, Israel is the only country in the region. Let's assume we understand what is the region and who are included in it, that has the nuclear weapons. And this so-called constructive ambiguity or a structural ambiguity, I guess, may be a plausible argument for some Americans and Israelis, but for the rest of international community, I guess the assumptions is that Israel has the nuclear weapons. There is nothing ambiguous. There is nothing ambiguous about those weapons which Israel owns. So, if we assume that is the case, then another question would be, under what circumstances and condition Israel may give up its weapons, its arms? To me, number one reason that, or number one condition that should be met for Israelis to give up is there is an effective pressure in Israel to give up the weapons. But those who are in a position in today's world to apply such pressures are not willing to apply that pressure. They are allies of Israel. I'm talking basically about Israel, I'm talking about the US principally, and then the Europe. So we don't see that pressure is going to come. So that condition cannot be met. And I don't see for the foreseeable future any effective pressure on Israel to give up that, to give up the weapons. Issue number two is if other countries have access or find access to nuclear weapons. Here I would use Kenneth Walt's argument. In other words, unless other countries, at least one, preferably more, countries have weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. Thus, Israel may feel that, okay, it's into its interest to enter to any sort of a negotiation, to control, to reduce, or to eliminate its weapons of mass destruction. And in the absence of that, I don't see basically that happens. To me, there are 2 points which I would like to mention here. One is sort of imbalance existed in the Middle East, and a sort of a balance existed in the sub-region of the Persian Gulf. Both of them have changed since last decade, to a large extent thanks to Americans and to some extent to our nuclear and missile programs. That imbalance, basically in the region of the Middle East, was Israel was acting like a superpower, sort of a supremacy which it had and military edge which it has, and they wanted to keep that. In other words, any minute deciding about any countries attacking Iraq, attacking Syria, attacking Lebanon, with no potential cost, effective cost, so they would have done it. Somehow, our nuclear program in Iran and the missile program created an image, a perception that there may be a parity, maybe a balance, which of course the reality is far from this perception, but anyway the perceptions are extremely important for making our decisions. So to me, one of the reasons that Israel opposed basically the way the deal, the JCPOA was made, which I would address that issue next Tuesday, was to me, one of the reasons was basically they wanted to change that perception. For changing that perception, it was not enough to control basically or to manage our enrichment program. Its total elimination would have been preferred for the perception which they were looking for, which existed before. And the other one, that was a balance in the Persian Gulf between Iran and Iraq. Iraq could balance us. So due to American invasion of Iraq, that balance changed to an imbalance. Again, there is another perception in the Persian Gulf that Iran is acting like a superpower. So both of these phenomena were not things that Israelis and Americans liked. So to me, basically, U.S. policies in the last several years, and Israeli policy too, have been restoration of the old order. In other words, another imbalance in the region of the Middle East and a balance in the GCC, in a balance in the Persian Gulf. The balance is going to be created by the GCC, and the imbalance is going to be created again by controlling Iranian nuclear program and the missile program. Thus, that's why a lot of pressure now about our missile programs. So these are important factors in the mindset of the Israelis, basically for the program, for the way they treat the JCPOA. And to me, basically, it is almost impossible that Israeli would give up the weapons unless another country, in reality, not perception, have the weapons. There is a third point then that I would like to discuss, the third condition that should be met for Israelis to give up their weapons. And that's, they do it voluntarily. They find it in their interest that, okay, they would give up, it is in their interest to give up the weapons. But how they may do that voluntarily? To me, a number of factors would influence their decision in that regard. we should not forget what basically mankind has done to the Jews throughout the history. You know, some countries, some people may have been better, or some others may have been worse, but we all have been unfair, put it very mildly, to the Jews. So they perceive the mankind as somehow have been very discriminatory against them, and they have basically exercised a lot of discrimination against them, and they have to the conclusion that they have to rely on their own resources to provide their security and peace and stability. So that is a very important factor to have in mind, that would shape their security environment and the security decisions that they make. So that's one factor, the historical experience which they have had. Issue number 2 is, if there is not, or let's put it this way, the absence of threat in the immediate security environment. So as long, or at least existential threat. So as long as that existential threat they perceive, they feel it is there, so I doubt they are not going to do it voluntarily. In other words, they're not going to go for a voluntary giving up their weapons. Issue number 3 is, as I said, they want also a sort of supremacy in the region too. It is not just security, peace, defense. It is a projection of power too. They would like to have a military edge against all the others, and they would like to basically have a sort of superiority of the power regarding every other countries in the region. So if we assume that if there are other means that can preserve their superiority, then they may give up voluntarily the weapons of mass destruction. So that's another constitutive part of their security defense strategy to me. Next issue is, getting something in return. The gain which they are going to get is extremely important too. Something really very valuable for them that they give up the weapons they have. So naturally, if they can get the peace and security through sort of a, negotiation or whatever, if they can get that one, if they can get technologically very advanced weaponaries that still keep the military edge which they have, and a lot of economic gains, they may persuade them, with such a kind of gains, yes, it's worth to give up. So then, all things considered, all these factors considered, unfortunately, I'm not all that optimist. Although by nature, and I'm optimist individual, I'm not optimist that those things can be achieved, and Israelis are not going to give up what they have voluntarily. I don't think that any country is close in the region to have nuclear weapons. And I guess also basically I don't see the application of effective force there too. So neither of the 3 conditions which I mentioned, not the application of effective force and not voluntarily, I don't see any chance that the Israelis are going to give up their weapons of mass destruction. And unless these things can be addressed, I'm not all that, unfortunately, hopeful. Thank you.
I hope the next speaker will comment a little bit on the lava negotiating process and to how close or how distant he was from achieving his mandate, because when it comes to the next review conference, I think that is an important consideration. Thank you. Ambassador Khaled Shamaa will now speak.
Thank you, Ambassador. First, let me say that the first presentation was an in-depth overview of, not sure to call it the strategy, the how. From my side, I will be giving you a much simpler task. It will be more of a simple story. Although Ambassador Dhanapala took some of my notes, but nevertheless, for the sake of the final lesson that we learn out of that story, I might be repeating some of the elements that he said and maybe contradicting one. But before I do that, first I would like to thank Pugwash and Professor Paulo Cotta, as well as the government of Kazakhstan for hosting me. Moving, not necessarily with regard to the UN resolutions that you have touched upon, but I'll focus more on the track of the NPT. The goal of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East is one that has been sought after for well over 40 years. And actually, we can describe that goal as being only more recent compared to two other goals, namely achieving nuclear disarmament and a world free of nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, these three elements, establishing nuclear weapon-free zones, achieving nuclear disarmament, and the world free of nuclear weapons, are among the core principles of what you have been discussing at length today, namely the NPT. Over the years, though, what we have witnessed is that successive and various nuclear weapon-free zones have been established in various parts of the world. Notwithstanding that, as I mentioned, over 40 years, the goal of establishing the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone has been sought after, but so far never realized. To the point that a few years ago, a very senior and respectable minister described it as the following. He described the Middle East issue, or the establishment of the nuclear weapon-free zone, as the biggest challenge to the nuclear order is the Middle East. Thus, it was only natural that the specific case of the Middle East be accorded that special status within the nuclear regime, and more specifically within the NPT review cycles. That special status of the Middle East was further emphasized, as you mentioned, Ambassador Dhanapala, quite rightly, that the extension of the NPT itself was only possible after the tabling by the Russian Federation, the UK, and the US and subsequent adoption of the 1995 resolution on the Middle East. Now, just to remind ourselves, what does that resolution talks about? That resolution, in that resolution, all states of the region were requested to take practical steps aimed at the establishment of an effectively verifiable zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. It then calls on states of the region, not party to the NPT, to accede to it, thereby accepting an international legally binding obligation not to acquire nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices and accept IAEA safeguards on all their nuclear activities. The reason why the resolution mentions all states of the region is because at the time, as you're all aware, there were more than one country in the region that was not party to the NPT. That was the year 1995. During the following 5 years, all the states in the region, with the exception of Israel, became party to the NPT. Thus, the states party to the NPT called specifically on Israel at the 2000 NPT Review Conference to accede to the treaty and place its nuclear facilities under IAEA comprehensive safeguards. Why that needs to be mentioned, so that it's also quite clear that the progression of the documents and the calls by states parties to the NPT is not in a sense of targeting a particular country, but it is simply a reflection of the reality on the ground. With the conclusion of the 2005 NPT Review Conference without an agreement on a final outcome document, and here is where I contradict Ambassador Dhanapala, because there were actually two areas of disagreement, namely nuclear disarmament, but also the Middle East. It was not possible to achieve any progress until the 2010 NPT Review Conference. Now, at the 2010 Review Conference, and for the first time, that implementation mechanism that was not present in the 1995 resolution was agreed upon through the so-called 2010 Action Plan, which called upon the Secretary General of the UN and the 3 depository states, in view of their special responsibility, and also as co-sponsors of the resolution, to convene a conference in 2012 on the establishment of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Now, as you're all aware, that conference never took place, even though a facilitator has been appointed by the conveners almost roughly 2 years after 2010. And a series of consultations were conducted by Ambassador Layava, in the margin of movement that was given to him. Now, I don't want to, I noted your question, but I do not want to go into too many details because it's not really a very pleasant story. But just to give you a flavor of it, one of the meetings that were held in Geneva, I believe, not the Glion ones, wasted half a day in a discussion on whether a UN security guard should be present in front of the building where the representatives were meeting or not. That gives you a flavor of, I don't want to use the word banality, but it's something very similar to it, to be polite. And that is, instead of discussing things like what you refer to when you refer to the study that Nabil Fahmy and others were part of what constitutes the region and the other practical elements of the establishment of the region. So, at the end of that, these several so-called meetings, or meetings, whichever way you want to put it, it became clear that the political will that was present in 2010 and that allowed the conclusion of the agreement on the final document was no longer the one that was still there by at least one of the co-sponsors. Of course, that lack of political will overflew into 2015, which in turn failed to reach an agreement. But here also, let's be clear on what happened in 2015. In 2015, we were fined by the draft outcome document presented by the president of the conference. Everybody was, with the exception of 3 states, UK, US, and Canada. So even the disappointment with no progress achieved in terms of convening 2012 did not prevent us from engaging very actively and constructively with all states parties and with the Secretariat, with the President, until we reached that draft final document, which was only shooted down on the last day by those 3 countries. Now, we've had a PrepCom this year. I don't know if somebody might wish to say something about it. I haven't heard much about that one today. But in any way, while preparations are underway for the 2020 review conference, there remains a logical question. So what's next? And how do we move from here to achieve 2 objectives that would be necessary? First, how to move forward with the implementation of the 1995 resolution, and hence pave the way for the possible success of the 2020 review conference. Now, on what's next, I would not venture really on spelling out any steps. Why is that? Because prior to 2010, the success that took place in 2010 benefited actually from several factors. Yes, there was a positive political atmosphere, let's put it that way without naming names. But at the same time, there was a long and tremendous amount of effort done in the over 2 years prior to the conference itself by lots of civil society organizations, member states, various stakeholders. It was a truly well-prepared preparatory process that led to a successful conference. Now, 2015, not too sure about how much preparation actually went into it. This time round, still to be seen. We are almost, 2.5 years ahead of us. But definitely, there is lots of work that needs to be done. But why is it that there is need to do such work? Well, let me give you a few observations. And especially having participated in the negotiation of the 2010 action plan, I can say that this time round, first to start with, the League of Arab States and its member states will not be presenting a new action plan or proposals. If there are any proposals to be made, it has to be the responsibility of the depositories of the NPT, as well as the Secretary General of the UN as a co-convener. Why is that? Well, very simply, since the previous commitments in 2010 did not go through in terms of implementation, but they were adopted and agreed to by everybody. The second element, and I believe that we need to be quite clear about that. Even having heard the 3 points by Nasser, maintaining the status quo is untenable. And at best, that would fall into the realm of wishful thinking. Why do I say that? Well, a couple of years ago, the notion of, and you can say whatever you want about it, if it is exactly what you wished for, if it could have more, less, the ban treaty. We have definitely moved quite a substantial step forward. When you hear people today talking about the fact that you have an international treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons and bans nuclear weapons in as much as chemical and biological weapons, that in itself definitely is a big step forward. Now, how does that play into what we will be facing in 2020? Well, definitely that will be impacting on it. And thanks for that to the civil society and member states who have really spearheaded the work on changing the nature of the so-called nuclear order. And maybe that is what we will need to start calling it, and not the NPT regime. For that change that took place is something that needs to be looked at very carefully and closely. Why? For one, it has broken a very long stalemate in nuclear disarmament negotiations. But also it comes, as I mentioned, as the natural progression in any nuclear regime. And here, one more element that makes this quite critical is something that was mentioned this morning by the UN High Representative for Disarmament, which is very true, that the NPT was initially a stopgap measure, meaning it's not the end game. And that could be one of the impacts of the ban treaty, whether in its current format or upon further amendments or protocols as it may be. Second point I would like to, or third point I would like to refer to. Also, the UN High Representative mentioned the need to confront the 21st century challenges of proliferation. And that is definitely an element that's out there. There is need to strengthen the treaty. You know, there's a whole list of need to do items. But also, let's be realistic. Do you think that we would be able in 2020 to tackle only the so-called 21st century challenges to proliferation? Remember that we are dealing with a supposedly balanced treaty in the sense that you have reciprocal obligations on nuclear weapon states and on non-nuclear weapon states. So, in addition to that, to achieve progress on the implementation of the 95 resolution. Therefore, either we lower our expectations, I don't see how, or we try to work to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves in all three of these areas, in disarmament, non-proliferation, as well as the Middle East. But of course, there is also an added complexity, which I didn't realize when I listened to Ms. Jennifer Simmons, but she only confirmed that it's the impression that the 2020 review conference will be very challenging in itself. So if we are serious about achieving anything out of it, and coming after 2015, that will be a very paramount task if we really need to and see value in maintaining the current NPT regime, non-proliferation regime, nuclear order, whatever you want to call it. But the current structure that we have. Work needs to be done by all, by the States Party, by civil society, but also by the UN Secretary General, who can play quite an active role in that regard. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have one more speaker on the panel who is from outside the region, but from within a nuclear weapon-free zone in Central Asia. And so let us have the benefits of her wisdom. Madame Kassenova.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. I'm grateful to Pugwash movement and to the Foreign Ministry of Kazakhstan for inviting me to speak here. My brief remarks will focus on the Central Asian experience with establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone, and it gives me special pleasure to do it on the panel with Ambassador Dhanapala, who personally contributed to the process. And I would also note the role of the United Nations in helping us as a region to get it done. When I was invited to the panel on the Middle East, I thought what I would do, aside from noting the special features of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, that I would do the overview of the challenges that our region faced when negotiating the treaty. So I guess the message of my remarks would be that it wasn't easy for us either, and I don't equate the level of complexity between our two regions, but I just want to remind the audience about our challenges and that it was possible to work them out. And the reason why I think it's important not to shy away from remembering obstacles and challenges, because it makes the final result, the success, sweeter. It shows the skill and talent of the diplomats and the policymakers who make it happen, but also because it gives hope that maybe other regions can eventually be able to establish similar zones, notwithstanding the difficulties that they face today, be it a complicated regional environment, security concerns, or other obstacles. So in terms of what makes our zone special, and there are 4 main points on that. The most important one for me as a Central Asian is the fact that it's the first treaty related to a nuclear weapon-free zone that recognizes the environmental damage from nuclear testing and the uranium industry. I've just come back from Semipalatinsk, where I had the privilege of talking to physicians and medical professionals, physicists, who still have so much work to do, who are still, they're doing what they can, and the message I get from them is that it will be years and years for us to know the full extent of the impact, because they are now monitoring 3rd and 4th generations of people who lived in the vicinity of the polygon. So I think that the fact that the text of the treaty included the environmental component is a very important tribute to the actual people of the region. The second special feature of the zone is that the Central Asian states were prepared to take additional obligations beyond a common set of obligations that non-nuclear weapon states usually take. More specifically, the treaty text required them to adhere to the International Atomic Energy Agency's additional protocol, to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and to the Convention on for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. In other words, Central Asians took it 3 steps further. The third element, the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone creates a disarmament pocket in a very complicated region where nuclear ambitions run high and proliferation challenges are significant. And finally, it's the first nuclear weapon-free zone in the Northern Hemisphere, and moreover, it's in the area where more than 1,000 weapons were located. But the road towards establishing the zone was not easy. It took Central Asia 15 years in negotiations, which maybe is not that long, but it also shows that it wasn't a one-day endeavor. There were differences both within the region among the Central Asian republics, but also points of contention between the Central Asian republics on one side and several nuclear weapon states, nuclear powers on the other. And when I say several, I mean specifically the United States, United Kingdom, and France. And of course, support of all nuclear powers is important to make any nuclear weapon-free zone efficient, because it's a standard that nuclear weapon states would take a legally binding obligation not to threaten or attack the members of the zone with their nuclear weapons by signing appropriate protocols to the treaty. As history shows, nuclear weapon-free zones are usually not that popular with nuclear powers, and bearing that in mind, Central Asian governments, they started involving nuclear powers in the process very early on, well before even the first draft was negotiated. And while they secured Russian and Chinese support for the zone, they've encountered opposition from the United States, France, and the United Kingdom from the draft stage of the treaty all the way through to its final text. Washington, London, and Paris specifically objected to 2 components of the treaty. First, to provisions governing the transportation of nuclear weapons and materials through the zone, because in their opinion, they argued that those provisions were not clear enough. And the second component, the second major point of contention, related to the relationship between the collective security treaty that several Central Asian states, Russia, and several other CIS states signed, so-called Tashkent Collective Security Treaty, and the zone that was supposed to be established. Why there was this concern in the 3 nuclear states? The Tashkent Treaty has a provision that rules that the members of the treaty will provide assistance to each other, including military, in case one of them is under threat. And for 3 nuclear power states, the word military could have meant that it could refer to nuclear. And I would like to stop a little bit on this second point of contention. To expect Central Asian states to walk away from the only collective defense mechanism that they had was, of course, a bit unfair, an unfair expectation. But at the same time, support of all 5 nuclear powers was necessary to make the zone a success and viable. So here's an example, I think, of a diplomatic beauty. The Central Asian negotiators were able to craft very smart language, I think, but I'm biased, I'm from Central Asia. In the same article, they've inserted two provisions, and basically in one, they said that their commitment to all the previous treaties remains in place, but the second part of the same article said that they would do nothing that would go against fundamental principles of a nuclear weapon-free zone. That language was still not acceptable to the three nuclear powers, but eventually, several years later, and in a very good development, they all signed the protocol. It comes as no surprise that there was, internal, not difficulties, but matters that Central Asian republics had to sort out among themselves. These are 5 independent states with their own foreign policy and domestic policy priorities. And while I'm not privy to the negotiations between the governments, I would expect that, for example, that carefully negotiated article to deal with the concerns of the United States, UK, and France, I'm sure it took effort and compromise among the 5 to come up with this final version. There was also another example of how there was a point on which opinions among the 5 differed, and something that they were able to resolve among themselves. And that concerned the issue of import of foreign radioactive waste. At some point there was discussion whether to allow import of foreign low and mid-level radioactive waste, all with the purpose to get some financial resources in order to deal with the waste that was already in the region in some countries. And they were able to negotiate on this, and the final treaty text bans the import of any foreign radioactive waste into the region. So these are just 2 examples from the history of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone that remind us that the Central Asian states had to deal with geopolitical complexities, external pressures, and internal differences, but they succeeded in making it a reality. And I just want to conclude, I understand that every region has its own difficulties, and the difficulties are of different nature and of different level of complexity, but I just hope that with enough perseverance and effort, we might one day see a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. In my lifetime, maybe.
Thank you for your wishes.
Thank you very much. Well, our 3 panelists have displayed remarkable discipline in taking 15 minutes each. We have already encroached on the time of the next panel, but I think since we began late, we are entitled to some time, particularly for question and answers. And may I invite Ambassador Rolf Ekius, who I know was a consultant to Laeva, to comment a little bit on the Laeva episode in the history of the weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Would you like to say a few words, Rolf? Well, we are bringing the microphone to you.
No, it was, what was interesting was that Finland was offering Helsinki as the main the conference place. And Laeva managed to get flexibility in that. He promised, in 2 months we can do it, and then we were delayed another 2 months, so he never gave up. And it was a remarkable insistence and patience he showed. You could imagine that he succeeded to get a very active participation from most of the relevant states, including also Israel participated, of course, always creating the big question marks. Where is Israel ready to do with their nuclear weapons? But it was a challenge And I would say one had to be an optimist of a very special character to do this. And I think few could have done it better. I can only praise him. But if you look upon what conclusion we can draw from that for the future, and we have heard some very important observations there. Of course, this broad security strategic situation in the Gulf, it's a matter of great, it is not a matter of technical disarmament, it's a matter of strategies and strategy. And I think we don't have that for the moment. Jaakko had a certain, so to say, consistency in that. He never, didn't give up, he continued and continued, but the setbacks, it was very tough to get the, I would say, the results, which were no results, because we know that really there was no naive approach on this. We know the difficulties, we know all the complexities in this issue. I think we were well read into that after the years we worked. But I can only say that if we just start again, I would, I don't know in which shape Jaakko would be then, but it is, as we heard also from both the speakers on the zone issue, I think there are tremendous challenges, because I think every thread, every opportunity, every opening was carefully sort of considered, tested, and worked upon again and again. So the search has been already done. I'm not sure if, so I'm a little pessimistic, I must say, about the next, but as I certainly support every effort.
Much, Rolf. Yes, so we have about 3 hands. We begin with Batsanov, and then Tariq, and then you, sir.
Yes, thank you, Jayantha, and many thanks for the 3 speakers. I was kind of provoked into asking this question by rather brief references or comparison made between the process, as difficult as it is and will be, of establishing a zone in the Middle East and the process of negotiating the nuclear weapon prohibition treaty. And my question is as follows. In the nuclear weapon prohibition treaty, the way it came out, it appears that the negotiating parties, and in reality non-nuclear weapon states, were, or most of them, were prepared to conclude a treaty without chances that any of the nuclear weapon possessors would join the treaty anytime soon, and nevertheless, they all found it important. Of course, we'll see how many will sign, ratify, but so far, all of them have found it very important to conclude negotiations, to approve the treaty, and to be in the process of preparing it for signature. Now, if you apply similar logic to the zone, can the same approach work with the zone? And if not, what's the difference? Thank you.
We'll collect 3 questions and then I'll give the, yes, Tariq.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for Ambassador Khaled Shamaa, my good friend.
Please be brief.
Okay. At the 2017 PrepCom, it seemed that the Arab group lost its unity. There was a proposal by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and then there was a separate proposal by Egypt, and many observers felt that Egypt was no longer supported by the rest of the Arab group in furthering work on the nuclear weapon-free zone and the next steps. I will stop there, so thank you.
Yes, there was somebody here, yes, please. Yes, sir, there are many, many questions, and I have to recognize other hands also.
All of us support the goal of establishment of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. However, to start practical steps towards the establishment of such a zone, two real major obstacles have to be dealt with. And eventually, even diplomacy has to deal with the real issues. And those two obstacles are very real, in the sense that the way Israel treats them is not dependent on the character of the government in Jerusalem. For every Israeli government, it will be very difficult to embark on this road without taking care of these two obstacles. The first one, states that are going towards this goal have to feel that they have a reasonable level of confidence that they are secure. Now, in the Middle East, it's very difficult when states are not willing, are opposing the legitimacy of the existence of other states, and they are parading ballistic missiles on which it is written, "Death to Israel." That is the first issue. Now, how can you deal with such a problem when there is no willing to have a dialogue between these states on this subject? The second obstacle is the propensity of states in the Middle East not to comply with the agreements on which they are signed. The last demonstration was very recent. The regime, the Syrian regime, used chemical weapons operationally such a short time after they signed on the chemical weapons convention, and they went through a process of disarming. And after the disarming, they are using these weapons. And that is only one example. Now, I am not entirely pessimistic, because I think there is a growing awareness among states in the Middle East that they cannot deal with their security problems alone, and they need to cooperate on these issues. And there are first indications of cooperation between Arab states and Israel, for example. So my question to the panel would be, how can a process that will lead eventually to practical steps towards the establishment of such a zone can be built in a way that will take care and deal with these two essential subjects? Thank you.
We've had 3 questions, and I'll ask the 2 panelists from the region to respond, and then I'll have another round of questions. Right, please.
Again, I would like to bring your attention to the real problems. It is important to discuss about why in each review conference we achieved something or we did not achieve something. If, for instance, why Ambassador Layava was not able to organize the conference. These are all important, of course, but I guess by far the more important issue is the reality and the type of issue which I addressed. Because I have been involved, as I said, for 5-6 years, I guess, talking with the Egyptian, with Israelis, with the Europeans and the others in same group, same meeting, repeatedly. So, I concluded after all that, it is almost impossible to come up with any, no matter how many times we have the review conference, if we have 25 more, unless these real issues are addressed, we cannot get anywhere. That's why I'm not optimist in that regard. So we have to address the real issue. And the real issues are the type of which I mentioned. I would like to, in fact, pose this question to Khaled. Why? That's, in fact, exactly the question which I posed to your colleague in our meeting. Shamaa, that why Israeli should give up their weapons? Why? Forget about the review conferences. Why they have to give up? You know, they have it. They have the advantage. There is not effective pressure. They don't want to do it voluntarily, and they have all the benefits of it. No matter how, with what language we preach, they're not going to do it. As I said, only when those three conditions are met. Either another country has it, either there is something in return for them that's good for them, or there is effective pressure. I don't see any one of them. If you see a fourth way, if there is an alternative way, please let us know. Thank you.
Do you want me to give him the alternative way? Well, you've switched the order completely, but anyway, it's not about an alternative way. But if you look at the Middle East, currently, and leaving aside the bilateral issue, but who are the benefactors of the NPT regime in the Middle East? Currently. Who? Very well. Yet at the same time, you would hear Israeli officials, academics, and various, mentioning that they do not care about the NPT, they do not like the NPT. Even Jeremy, I believe, mentioned that in around or after maybe 2010. Yet at the same time, as General Shlomo just mentioned, that Israel is in favor of, or let me quote you correctly, all of us support the goal of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. That is an important statement. That's a beginning. Now, your experience that you have described now was actually very interesting. Because, and I was thinking while you were describing, lucky you, because you had a negotiation. While you were so gentle, as always, when you were describing the role of the facilitator, which is right, he did lots of efforts. But just remember, it was not the facilitator on his own. So, you know, but the problem is that I can't even call it a process, but whatever followed 2010 was not even a negotiation. Yes, you had the representation from Israel, from Iran at times. I'm not sure Syria, I think they might have attended one or two, and from several of the Arab states. But it was not even, I cannot call it a negotiation. As I explained to you, half a day was wasted because the representative of Israel did not want a UN security guard in front of the building where they were meeting in Geneva. Well, it just happened that that building was a certain organization, I can't even remember now which was it, in Geneva. So it's only natural that there is a security officer. But that became an issue. And that just shows you that when I hear what you say, that you support and you are all for establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone, that's fine and well. But that needs to be put into action. And here the action definitely, Ambassador, under no circumstance did I suggest that we would go the way of the ban treaty with regard to nuclear weapon-free zone treaty in the Middle East. Why? Because if that was the case, we Arab states on our own could have established that, made the agreement and implemented it. So that's definitely not the objective. On the contrary, we need an agreement for all the states of the region, the Arab states, Israel, Iran. You mentioned that it does not depend on any government in Tel Aviv. Well, you have said the words that you support the goal of the establishing of the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Natural thing is to move to the following, and that opportunity was there. Now, where are we now? That's to be seen, frankly.
Khaled, of course, that was a conditional statement he made. He said that there should not be no state basically threatening us, and also states should be committed to their promises, which is very subjective. But at least the second one is very
but you know
subjective.
What?
So if, of course,
I like to take the part. I like to take the part on which I can work on, and my objective is to achieve progress, to start negotiations. It is possible. It is doable, because there is another option, and that was my first response to you. And that is, if we hit 2020 and there are no prospects of progress, then what? Will we just be satisfied by yet another failed review conference? If you consider that fine, okay.
We're taking a lot of time. Can I fulfill my promise? There was somebody here, Ms. Carlos Teresa, and then the two ladies there.
Thank you. The proposal for a WMD...
Can't hear. We'll have to make sure that the mic is on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Better? The proposal goes back to, we said, 40 years, and it is a super ambitious proposal, because not only nuclear weapons, but other weapons of mass destruction and delivery means. I mean, in the meantime, the situation in the Middle East has changed completely. I mean, Syria has joined the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is a significant gesture in spite of the fact that they probably don't abide by it. JCPOA has been established in the zone. A ban treaty has been finalized. So the situation has changed completely. Arab Spring and so on. So is it still realistic to pursue this global objective, and should we not redefine and go back to a nuclear weapon-free zone, which actually we have always been speaking on nuclear weapon-free zone. We confuse the two concepts. But really the NPT, in the framework of the NPT, why should we discuss delivery means, discuss chemical and biological weapons? So couldn't we have the courage to go back to a more feasible?
We are pressed for time, so make your question,
finished,
please.
Finished. Thank you.
Canadian Pugwash, behind you.
Yeah, hi. My name's Erica Simpson, and I'm a professor of international politics at Western University in Canada. And in the Pugwash group in Canada, we've been pressing and pushing and trying to get an Arctic nuclear weapon-free zone. We've been spearheaded by Adele Buckley on the International Council, who couldn't be here, but she said, you know, Erica, get some advice. And so I need your frank advice, because we have limited resources and few people. What should we do to get an Arctic nuclear weapon-free zone? Thank you.
I think we'll have to discuss that in another panel or in a working group. Angela Kane.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but it's very hard because just like Rolf Ekeus, I spent the better part of 3 years working on the WMD-Free zone in the Middle East with Ambassador Layeva at the head. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it was. And I agree with you that we spent like half a day because of the question of the security guards. But I think that also it was very, very difficult because you've got one country which did come to all of the meetings, and even to agree on meeting dates was very difficult because there was always either a Jewish holiday or there was an Arab holiday or there was a UN holiday. And so even to find dates...
We'll unify Jewish and Muslim holidays together.
Yeah, yes, you're right. And basically that was very difficult. But on the other hand, it was also very difficult to have one country on one side and to have a committee on the other side that is negotiating. That has to go through the senior officials committee. There had to be written papers that were given that we had to respond to. So I think this issue needs to be revived. It needs to be revived maybe with some modifications, but particularly the modalities need to be revived. And there has to be an understanding beforehand. It's not going to go away. And I was also very disappointed because the three guarantors basically broke apart in the end, particularly in 2015 when we came to that. And that was very unfortunate that that could not be bridged. I don't know exactly where this lies now. I fear that the NPT review conference is going to be greatly affected by it, so it needs to be attacked pretty quickly, and it needs to be done in a way that everyone is on board how we're actually going to do it, because the previous format clearly did not work as it was. Thank you.
I think I will conclude the meeting now because we have to be fair by the next panel. And then there is the reception after that. So we are really encroaching far into the territory of others. Do you want a last word? Okay.
Just 30 seconds, because I think what was mentioned by Angela Kane is quite important. Because, yes, it is a fact, apart from the statement by General Shlomo, yes, Israel participated at the meetings, called them whatever, track 2, track 1.5, whatever track it was. Yes, but something did not sort of, how do you call it, fit properly. I agree fully with you. 2020, along with the list of issues that are jeopardizing it, unless we find a way forward on the issue of implementation of the 95 resolution, would be in serious jeopardy, because there will be no value, frankly, in it. When you hear Ms. Kazumi this morning saying about, you know, the 21st century, we are still in 1968, you know. We're still dealing with the baggage of 1968. We're not even there ready for the 21st century. So, you know, you want to fly away for the 21st century? Go ahead, but we're not part of that. We cannot. And that is the core issue here. Sorry for the time. Thank you.
To join us in thanking the three panelists for their contribution today. Thank you very much. Over to the next panel, and that's going to be on nuclear dangers, chaired by Cliff Kupchan. And we'll have Rakesh Sood, Devia Danieli, and Talat Masood.